They have been told that the more one gives, the more one will be loved. Yet in practice, the man who gives without restraint often finds himself surrounded not by love, but by quiet entitlement. People grow accustomed to his giving. They stop noticing it. What was once appreciated becomes expected, and expectation is the silent killer of gratitude. There is a particular cruelty in this transformation. The useful man does not notice it at first. He believes he is strengthening relationships, building loyalty, securing his place in the world. But slowly, the tone of requests changes. There is less asking, more assuming, less thanks, more urgency, less recognition, more pressure. And he wonders, sometimes late at night, when it changed. It changed the moment usefulness became predictable. A wolf that hunts every night in the same place eventually starves. Not because prey disappears, but because predictability invites exploitation. Hunters begin to wait for him. Traps are laid. The very consistency that once ensured success becomes the cause of his downfall. So it is with men. The man who is always there, always helping, always available, becomes easy to use precisely because he never withdraws. There is no risk in asking him. There is no cost in demanding more. And where there is no cost, there is no respect. Respect requires the possibility of loss. This is a truth many find difficult to accept. They wish to be liked, to be seen as dependable, to be known as generous. But respect is born, not from pleasing others, but from the quiet understanding that one's time and energy are not freely accessible. It is the boundary, not the sacrifice, that commands regard. Consider the court of a Renaissance ruler. Advisors crowded the halls, each eager to prove their usefulness, each ready to offer solutions, each striving to be indispensable. Yet the ruler listened most carefully to the one who spoke least, the one who appeared only when necessary, the one whose silence carried weight. Why? Because restraint suggests depth, silence suggests control, and control suggests power. The useful man speaks often because he feels compelled to prove himself. The sovereign man speaks rarely because he knows his value does not require constant demonstration. There is a profound difference between the two. One seeks approval, the other commands attention. The tragedy is that most men spend years training themselves to be useful, but almost no time learning to be formidable. They sharpen their skills, refine their knowledge, increase their productivity, believing that competence alone will grant them authority over their lives. But competence without boundaries is servitude. The world does not reward the most capable man. It rewards the man who understands how and when to withhold his capability. This withholding is not laziness. It is strategy. To reveal everything one can do is to surrender leverage. To give endlessly is to erase one's own importance. The man who solves every problem deprives others of the chance to struggle, and in doing so, he makes himself the permanent servant of their comfort. And comfort, once granted, becomes a demand. There is also a deeper psychological shift that occurs when a man is always useful. He begins to anticipate the needs of others before they are even spoken. He organizes his life around expectations that may never have been explicitly stated. He lives in a constant state of readiness, like a soldier who never leaves the battlefield. Such vigilance slowly erodes the spirit, because a life lived in reaction is not a life directed by one's own will. It is a life shaped by external forces, by the endless tide of demands that pull a man further and further from his own ambitions. And ambition, neglected long enough, does not merely sleep, it withers. There are men who wake one morning and realize that years have passed since they pursued anything purely for themselves. Their days were spent solving, fixing, supporting, answering, and while they were busy preserving the lives of others, their own remained unfinished. This realization is not dramatic. It does not arrive with thunder. It arrives quietly, like dust settling in an abandoned room. And it is in that quiet moment that a man begins to see the cost of being endlessly useful. He sees the dreams postponed, the opportunities declined, the risks never taken. He sees the version of himself that might have existed had he guarded his time as fiercely as he guarded the comfort of others. And he understands, perhaps for the first time, that usefulness without intention is a form of slow self-erasure. The world rarely notices this erasure. It continues to ask, to demand, to expect. It continues to consume whatever is offered freely. And if the useful man finally falters, if he finally says no, if he finally withdraws, the reaction is often not gratitude for what he gave, but irritation at what he no longer provides. This is the final proof. He was never valued for who he was, only for what he did. And when a man understands this fully, something begins to change inside him. Not bitterness, not anger, something colder, clearer, more precise. He begins to see the game. To see the game is to feel a strange calm settle over the mind. The useful man, once awakened, begins to observe the world differently. He notices how conversations shift when he delays his response. He notices how quickly urgency fades when he does not rush to solve it. He notices how problems that once seemed to demand his immediate intervention are suddenly resolved by others when he is no longer available. And this realization is both liberating and unsettling, because it reveals a truth few wish to confront. Many of the burdens he carried were never truly his to bear. They were simply convenient for others to place upon him. Convenience is a powerful force. People follow the path of least resistance, and the useful man becomes that path. He is the easiest solution, the most reliable answer, the most predictable source of support. And so the world flows toward him endlessly, without pause, without hesitation. But the moment he steps aside, the flow redirects. Others adapt. Others take responsibility. Others discover capabilities they never needed to develop before. And he begins to understand that his constant usefulness was not always an act of generosity. Sometimes it was an act of interference. By solving every problem, he prevented others from growing. By carrying every burden, he encouraged others to remain weak. By making himself indispensable, he built a prison whose walls were made of expectations. This realization does not make him cruel, it makes him precise. Machiavelli understood that power often lies not in action but in restraint. The general who commits his forces too early loses flexibility. The ruler who reveals all his intentions loses leverage. And the man who gives all his energy leaves himself with nothing to command. Restraint is not passivity, it is control over timing. There is a profound difference between the man who cannot help himself from acting and the man who chooses when to act. One is driven by impulse or obligation, the other is guided by design. And design is the foundation of authority over one's own life. The awakened man begins to experiment quietly. He does not announce his transformation. He does not declare new rules or boundaries with dramatic speeches. He simply begins to pause. He lets messages wait. He allows others to struggle. He makes small requests without explanation. And he observes. At first, there is resistance, confusion, even irritation. People who were accustomed to immediate answers begin to ask what is wrong. They may accuse him of changing, of becoming distant, of losing his generosity. But beneath these accusations lies something more revealing. They are not mourning the loss of his friendship. They are mourning the loss of his convenience. This distinction, once seen, cannot be unseen. There is a certain cold clarity that arrives in this stage. The man begins to understand that relationships built entirely on usefulness are not relationships at all. They are transactions disguised as affection. And transactions, by their nature, end when the value exchange ends. This understanding does not make him withdraw from the world completely. It makes him selective. He begins to ask himself a question he never asked before. Is this request aligned with the life I am building, or is it merely consuming the life I already have? This question becomes a compass, and like any true compass, it does not always point toward comfort. Sometimes it directs him away from people who have been in his life for years. Sometimes it leads him into solitude, into long stretches of silence where the noise of constant demands no longer reaches him. And in that silence, something long buried begins to re-emerge. His own thoughts. For years, perhaps decades, his mind was occupied with the problems of others. Plans, deadlines, crises, responsibilities, endless cycles of reaction. But now, in the absence of constant interruption, he begins to think again, not about what others need, but about what he wants to build, what he wishes to become, what kind of life would truly satisfy him. This rediscovery is both exhilarating and frightening, because freedom is heavier than obligation. Obligation tells a man what to do. Freedom demands that he decide for himself. Many retreat at this stage. They return to usefulness because it is familiar, because it provides structure, because it shields them from the uncertainty of choosing their own path. It is easier to be needed than to be self-directed, but the man who continues forward begins to feel a quiet strength growing within him. Not the loud, boastful confidence of those who seek attention, but a deeper, steadier assurance. The assurance that his time belongs to him, that his energy is no longer scattered, that his life is no longer being consumed in fragments. This strength changes the way he moves through the world. He speaks less, but his words carry more weight. He commits to fewer things, but fulfills them with greater precision. He no longer rushes to fill every silence. And because of this, others begin to lean closer when he does speak. Scarcity creates gravity. This is the paradox of power that Machiavelli observed in courts and kingdoms alike. The man who is always present becomes invisible. The man who appears selectively becomes unforgettable. Presence gains value when it is not constant. There is also a subtle shift in how others treat him. Some drift away, unable to tolerate the loss of easy access. Others begin to show a new respect, sensing that he is no longer governed by the same compulsions as before. And a few, the rare few, reveal themselves to be genuine, remaining not because of what he provides, but because of who he is. These are the relationships that endure. The rest were only passing arrangements, sustained by convenience and habit. As this transformation deepens, the man begins to understand that usefulness in itself is not the enemy. The true danger lies in unconscious usefulness, in giving without intention, in serving without direction, in sacrificing without purpose. A sword is useful, but it is not drawn at every moment. A strategist is useful, but he does not reveal every plan. A ruler is useful to his people, but he does not surrender his will to their every demand. Usefulness must be governed, or it becomes a master. And mastery over oneself begins with a single realization, one that changes everything. A man's life is not measured by how much he gives away, but by how much of himself he preserves, that only he can do. There comes a stage in this transformation when the man begins to notice something even more unsettling than the loss of time or energy. He begins to see how usefulness reshapes his identity in the eyes of others. At first, he believed people valued him, but now he sees that what they valued was access. Access to his skills, access to his time, access to his reliability, and access once granted without limit becomes assumed as a permanent right. This is the quiet erosion of status. In every hierarchy, whether in courts, companies, or families, status is not determined solely by competence. It is determined by perception, and perception is shaped by scarcity, by control, by the ability to choose rather than react. The man who is always available unconsciously lowers his perceived value. Not because he lacks ability, but because he appears to lack boundaries. And boundaries, more than talent, signal self-respect. Self-respect is a language the world understands instinctively. It requires no explanation. It is communicated through posture, through timing, through the willingness to withdraw when necessary. The useful man, before his awakening, rarely withdraws. He believes that constant presence is loyalty, that constant giving is virtue, that constant agreement is harmony. But in reality, constant presence breeds familiarity, and familiarity, when unchecked, breeds disregard. Respect does not survive in an environment of endless availability. Consider the lion in the wild. He does not hunt every hour. He does not roam endlessly in search of approval from the herd. He moves when he chooses, rests when he chooses, appears when he chooses. And because of this, his presence carries weight. The very uncertainty of his movements commands attention. Power is often a matter of rhythm, not force. The awakened man begins to change his rhythm. He does not rush to respond. He does not volunteer for every task. He does not fill every silence with words. And at first, this feels unnatural, almost uncomfortable, as if he is breaking a long-established pattern. But patterns, once broken, reveal how fragile they truly were. He begins to notice that many situations resolve themselves without his intervention. Conflicts that once demanded his mediation settle on their own. Problems that once seemed urgent are forgotten. Deadlines that once created panic are extended or adjusted. And he realizes something profound. Urgency is often an illusion sustained by those who benefit from his compliance. This realization changes the way he perceives pressure. What once felt like obligation now appears as negotiation. What once felt like necessity now appears as choice. And in recognizing choice, he begins to reclaim authority over his time. Authority over time is the foundation of freedom. Machiavelli observed that a ruler who allows others to dictate his schedule soon loses control of his state. Every petition, every request, every demand becomes a chain pulling him in different directions until he is no longer ruling, but merely reacting. The same principle governs the life of any man. When his hours are claimed by others, his destiny is no longer his own, and destiny, once surrendered, is rarely returned. There is also a deeper transformation taking place within him. As he withdraws from constant usefulness, he begins to confront parts of himself he had long ignored, ambitions he postponed, skills he never developed, ideas he never pursued. These fragments of his true self, once buried beneath endless obligations, begin to surface. At first, this can feel disorienting. Without the noise of constant demands, the mind becomes quiet. And in that quiet, a man is forced to face the question he avoided for years. What do I truly want? It is a question more difficult than any problem he solved for others, because it requires honesty, it requires courage, it requires the willingness to disappoint those who expect him to remain exactly as he was. And disappointment, for the former useful man, is a fear deeply ingrained. He was trained to avoid it at all costs, to smooth conflicts, to satisfy expectations, to maintain harmony. But harmony purchased at the cost of one's own life is not harmony. It is surrender. The awakened man begins to accept that some people will be displeased. Some will accuse him of becoming selfish, distant, or changed. And in a sense, they are correct. He has changed.
Good morning.
He has begun to place value on his own existence. This shift is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, almost invisible, but its consequences are profound. He begins to plan his days with intention. He begins to protect his time as a resource, not a commodity to be distributed freely. He begins to recognize that every hour given away is an hour that can never be reclaimed. Time is the only currency that cannot be earned back. This understanding sharpens his judgment.
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Where he invests his energy. He chooses projects
Just woke
that
up,
build
so
rather than
thought I'd do a live.
He chooses relationships that strengthen rather than drain. He chooses silence over unnecessary conversation, focus over distraction, purpose over approval. And with each choice, his life begins to take shape according to his own design. There is a moment, subtle but unmistakable, when he realizes that he is no longer reacting to the world. He is directing himself within it. The difference is small in appearance, but immense in consequence. Reaction is survival. Direction is power. As this power grows, he begins to see another truth that few recognize. The world does not collapse when he withdraws. It continues.
Yes, indeed.
Systems adjust. Life moves forward without his constant intervention.
Sitting half naked on my bed.
And this is strangely liberating, because it means he is no longer responsible for carrying what was never his to carry. He can choose where to stand. He can choose when to act. He can choose when to remain still. And in this freedom, he begins to rediscover a sense of dignity that youthfulness alone could never provide. Dignity does not come from being needed. It comes from being sovereign. The sovereign man serves others, but he does so by choice, not compulsion. He gives, but he does not deplete himself. He contributes, but he does not surrender control of his life. And in this balance lies a strength far greater than endless usefulness. A strength that cannot be exploited, because it is governed by will. As this sovereignty begins to take root, the man notices something unexpected. The world does not simply react to his change, it tests it. Requests return, sometimes subtly, sometimes with greater intensity than before. Old patterns attempt to reassert themselves. People who once relied on him try again to draw him back into the familiar role. They speak of urgency, of necessity, of how much he is needed. And in these moments, the true transformation is measured, because it is easy to withdraw once. It is far more difficult to remain withdrawn when pressure returns. The pull of habit is strong. The desire to be seen as dependable, as generous, as indispensable, whispers quietly in the mind. But the awakened man begins to recognize this whisper for what it is. Not a voice of virtue, but a remnant of conditioning, a reflex trained over years, perhaps decades, to equate usefulness with worth. And now he sees the danger clearly. A man who ties his worth to usefulness places his identity in the hands of others. If they need him, he feels valuable. If they do not, he feels diminished. His sense of self rises and falls with the demands of the world, like a ship tossed endlessly by changing tides. But a ship that never anchors cannot chart its own course. The sovereign man begins to build that anchor within himself. His worth is no longer measured by how much he provides, but by how faithfully he pursues the life he has chosen. His time becomes sacred, not in a ceremonial sense, but in a practical one. Each hour is seen as a fragment of life itself, not a trivial resource to be spent on every passing request. This perspective changes everything. He no longer rushes to prove his value. He no longer feels compelled to justify his decisions. He understands that explanation is often an invitation to negotiation, and negotiation is often an opening through which control is taken back from him. So he speaks simply. Sometimes he says no without elaboration. Sometimes he allows silence to answer where words once would have rushed forward. Silence, once feared, becomes his ally. There is a particular power in silence that few understand. Silence creates space. It forces others to confront their own thoughts. It interrupts the momentum of demands. And most importantly, it signals that a man is not governed by the expectations of the moment. Machiavelli observed that the most dangerous opponents were not those who shouted, but those who waited. The patient mind sees what the restless mind misses. The quiet observer understands the motives hidden beneath words, the intentions concealed behind urgency, and the sovereign man begins to see these motives everywhere. He notices how often requests are framed as emergencies when they are merely conveniences. He notices how frequently others seek reassurance rather than solutions, delegating not only tasks but also responsibility for their own uncertainty. He notices how easily people surrender their burdens to anyone willing to carry them, and he begins to refuse that burden, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Clarity is colder than kindness, but far more honest. There is also a shift in how he perceives generosity. Before he gave instinctively, almost automatically, as if generosity required no judgment. Now he understands that generosity without discernment becomes self-destruction. A well that pours endlessly into the desert does not create an oasis. It disappears. True generosity is measured, intentional, directed toward what truly matters. It strengthens rather than weakens. It builds rather than merely sustains. And above all, it never requires a man to abandon his own path. This understanding frees him from a subtle guilt that once haunted him. The guilt of saying no. The guilt of choosing himself. The guilt of declining what others believed he should accept. He begins to see that this guilt was never his to carry. It was a tool, often unconscious, used by others to maintain the comfort of their expectations. And once seen, such tools lose their power. The man who once feared disappointing others now begins to see disappointment differently. Disappointment is not always a sign of wrongdoing. Often it is simply the reaction of those who expected control and discovered limits instead. Limits are the architecture of freedom. Without limits, a man's life dissolves into the lives of others. Without limits, every request becomes an obligation, every expectation a chain. But with limits, time regains its structure, energy regains its direction, and purpose regains its clarity. Purpose, once rediscovered, begins to reshape his days. He wakes with intention, not urgency. He works on what advances his own vision, not merely what resolves the crises of others. He invests his strength where it multiplies, not where it is consumed, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, his life begins to expand, not in noise or spectacle, but in depth, in focus, in the quiet satisfaction of progress that belongs entirely to him. There is a dignity in this kind of progress that no applause can match, because it is not dependent on recognition. It is not fragile in the face of indifference. It is built on the steady, unshakable foundation of self-direction. And with this foundation comes a new kind of confidence. Not the loud confidence of those who seek validation, but the calm confidence of a man who knows he is no longer different.
Grapes for breakfast.
This confidence is subtle,
Wait for
but
breakfast.
others feel it. They sense the change in his presence, in his posture, in the way he speaks and moves. Some are drawn to it, sensing strength where once there was only reliability. Others are unsettled by it because it reminds them of their own dependence, their own lack of direction. But the sovereign man is no longer governed by these reactions. Approval and disapproval have lost their power over him. He has learned that the world will always judge, always expect, always demand, but it is his choice whether to comply. And in that choice lies the quiet, unassailable core of freedom. There is a final stage in this transformation, one that few reach, not because it is difficult to understand, but because it requires a courage most men never cultivate. It is the stage where usefulness is no longer a compulsion, no longer a reflex, but a weapon chosen deliberately and used with precision. The sovereign man does
No
not
wonder.
reject usefulness entirely.
What the fuck?
He refines it. He learns to give where it strengthens his position, where it builds alliances of substance, where it advances a vision greater than the approval of the moment. He no longer gives to be liked. He gives to create. And this difference changes everything. Because usefulness, when governed by intention, becomes power. It becomes leverage rather than liability. It becomes a tool placed on the table only when the moment demands it, not a chain worn constantly around the neck. Machiavelli understood this principle well. A ruler who distributes favors too freely weakens himself. But a ruler who grants assistance sparingly at decisive moments binds others to him with invisible threads of obligation and respect. Measured generosity creates gravity. The awakened man begins to see this gravity forming around him. When he chooses to help, it is noticed. When he offers his time, it carries weight. When he speaks, others listen, because they know his attention is not easily obtained. Scarcity has transformed his presence. This transformation also alters the way he perceives ambition. Before ambition felt like a distant dream, something postponed until all responsibilities were fulfilled. But responsibilities, he discovered, are endless. There is always another request, another task, another demand waiting patiently to consume the hours meant for his own creation. Now he understands that ambition cannot wait for permission. It must be protected, guarded, defended against the slow erosion of endless obligations. Every empire, every work of greatness, every life of consequence was built by men who defended their time with ferocity. They were not cruel, they were not indifferent, but they understood that to give everything to everyone is to leave nothing for the work that matters most. And so the sovereign man builds his life as an architect builds a fortress. Each day is structured, each hour placed with intention, each commitment weighed against the vision he is pursuing. Distractions are turned away. Unnecessary obligations are declined. Energy is invested where it multiplies. This discipline creates a quiet momentum, almost invisible at first, but powerful beyond measure. Weeks pass, and progress accumulates. Months pass, and structures begin to rise, where once there was only scattered effort. Years pass, and the life he once imagined becomes reality, not through sudden bursts of effort, but through the steady preservation of his focus. Focus is the rarest currency in a distracted world, and the man who controls his focus controls his destiny. There is a scene, repeated in different forms throughout history, that captures this truth. A lone figure sits at a long table in a dimly lit room. Papers spread before him, plans unfolding, strategies forming. Outside, the world moves in noise and chaos. But inside, there is silence, concentration, direction. That silence is the birthplace of power. Because power is not forged in constant reaction. It is forged in deliberate creation. The useful man reacts. The sovereign man creates. And creation requires time. It requires energy. It requires the ruthless protection of both. As this understanding deepens, the man begins to feel something he has not felt in years, perhaps ever. A sense of ownership over his own existence. The knowledge that his days are no longer fragments scattered among the demands of others, but chapters in a story he is writing himself. This ownership brings a quiet satisfaction, deeper than pleasure, steadier than excitement. It is the satisfaction of alignment, of living in accordance with one's own design, rather than the expectations of the crowd. And with this alignment comes peace. Not the passive peace of comfort, but the active peace of clarity. The peace of knowing where one is going, of knowing why each step is taken, of knowing that one's life is no longer drifting without direction. This is the true reward of escaping the trap of unconscious usefulness. Not isolation, not indifference, but sovereignty. Sovereignty over time, sovereignty over attention, sovereignty over purpose. And from this sovereignty, a new kind of strength emerges. A strength that does not seek applause, does not depend on approval, does not require recognition. A strength rooted in the simple, unshakable knowledge that one's life belongs to oneself. There is a final truth that must be understood, one that Machiavelli himself would have recognized without hesitation. The world does not remember the man who was merely useful. It remembers the man who built, who shaped, who directed, who left behind something that bore the mark of his will. Usefulness may sustain a moment, but vision shapes an era. And so the question remains, not for the world, but for the man listening in silence. Will he spend his life being useful to the designs of others, or will he become the architect of his own? The answer, as always, will not be spoken in words. It will be written in how he chooses to live. If you have made it this far, it is because a part of you already knows this truth. The world rewards usefulness only as long as it benefits others. The moment you become too available, too reliable, or too willing to serve, people stop respecting you and start depending on you. Power belongs to those who choose when to give, not those who cannot refuse. Now tell me in the comments if you are ready to stop being useful at the cost of your own life. If this message touched you and made sense, write in the comments, I choose my path. Let us see how many here are truly ready to stop living for others and start living with intention. And do not forget, keep watching the next video. It is important, much more than you imagine. See you there.
Jung discovered something that made his blood run cold. There's a type of person walking among us who looks broken on the surface, quiet, withdrawn, damaged by their past, but underneath that exterior, something dangerous is forming, something most people will never understand. Jung studied what happens when empaths experience severe trauma and withdraw completely from society. And he found that only a small percentage of people who enter this psychological state survive the transformation intact. The rest, they either shatter completely under the weight of what they've seen, or they get stuck in a twilight zone between two worlds, too aware to fit back into normal society, too wounded to fully stand alone, trapped in a psychological no man's land that slowly destroys them from the inside out. Jung spent decades studying this pattern, patient after patient, case after case. And what he discovered changed everything he thought he knew about trauma, isolation, and human transformation. He realized he wasn't documenting mental illness. He was witnessing a process he called individuation under extreme duress, the kind that either kills you or makes you untouchable. If you've ever preferred being alone after experiencing betrayal, abandonment, or deep hurt, you might be in the middle of this dangerous process right now. And what comes next will determine whether you emerge transformed or remain trapped in unconscious suffering. They didn't choose to become loners. This is critical to understand. It wasn't a lifestyle preference or a personality quirk. It was a survival tactic born from necessity. They saw too much betrayal, too many smiling faces that concealed knives, too many promises that dissolved like sugar in rain, too many people who claimed they cared, but vanished the moment caring required actual sacrifice. Here's what Jung discovered that most people miss. These individuals were likely highly sensitive before they became isolated. They were the emotional shock absorbers for their families, their friend groups, their workplaces. Everyone dumped their pain into these people like they were psychological landfills, and they accepted it because they thought that's what love meant. That's what being good meant. That's what being valuable meant. They became experts at reading rooms before entering them. They learned to detect emotional landmines in conversations. They developed the ability to sense what people needed before those people even knew they needed it. This wasn't a gift from the universe. It was a survival skill forged in the fire of unpredictable chaos. Think about it. When your safety depends on correctly predicting your parents' mood, your brain rewires itself for threat detection. When your peace relies on managing everyone else's emotions, you become a human emotional radar. When your value is determined by how useful you are, you become indispensable by necessity, until they snapped. But before we get to that moment,
Oh,
you need to
20%
understand
battery.
what led up to it. Consider a case profile that perfectly illustrates Jung's observations on participation mystique and boundary dissolution. We see this dynamic clearly in the story of a young woman who spent 28 years absorbing everyone else's chaos. Her alcoholic father's unpredictable rage, her mother's martyrdom and silent resentment, her siblings' constant drama that always somehow became her responsibility to manage. She developed what we might now call heightened pattern recognition. She could predict her father's mood by the sound of his car door closing. She knew whether he'd had one drink or five by the weight of his footsteps on the stairs. She could sense her mother's incoming breakdown by subtle changes in vocal tone, by the way she stirred her coffee, by the particular silence that filled the house on certain mornings. She knew which sibling was about to create a crisis based on text message punctuation. A period instead of an exclamation mark meant trouble. No emoji meant something was wrong. Too many emojis meant they were hiding something. This wasn't psychic ability, it was survival mathematics. When your safety depends on reading the room correctly, your brain becomes a supercomputer of behavioral analysis. These individuals who eventually isolate don't just endure abuse, they study it, they catalog it. They become walking databases of human dysfunction. Every micro-expression, every tonal shift, every behavioral pattern. They store this information unconsciously, building a psychological archive that would terrify most people if they could see inside it. And here's what made Jung's hands shake when he wrote his clinical notes. These individuals never used this knowledge, not once. They had detailed maps of everyone's weaknesses, triggers, and insecurities. They could have weaponized this information at any moment. They knew exactly what to say to destroy someone emotionally. They understood the precise words that would shatter someone's confidence or expose their deepest fears. But they didn't. They just kept absorbing, kept hoping, kept believing that if they were good enough, patient enough, understanding enough, people would finally treat them with the care they deserved. They thought their kindness would eventually be rewarded, that their loyalty would eventually be reciprocated, that their unconditional love would eventually be valued. They were wrong. Then came the moment that changed everything. The final betrayal, the one that broke through decades of conditioning and forced them to see reality clearly. Maybe it was discovering infidelity after years of being told they were paranoid for asking questions. Maybe it was realizing their entire family scapegoated them to avoid their own dysfunction. Maybe it was the friend who disappeared when they finally needed support instead of giving it. Maybe it was overhearing what someone really thought about them after years of pretending to care. Maybe it was being blamed for setting a boundary after decades of having none. Maybe it was watching someone give to others. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. What they claimed they couldn't give to them. Whatever the trigger, something inside them clicked. A switch flipped that could never be unflipped. Jung would recognize this as the moment when an inner situation finally becomes conscious. And they entered what can be understood as 4 stages of transformation after severe relational trauma. Stage 1, the observation phase. They stop talking and start watching. This is where they become what we might call human lie detectors. But it's more than that. They've been observing their whole lives. The difference now is that they're observing consciously, deliberately, without the filter of hope that used to distort their perception. They notice everything. The way someone's eyes shift left when they're fabricating a story. The subtle change in breathing pattern when guilt surfaces. The micro-expression of contempt that flashes for a fraction of a second before the polite smile returns. They see the gap between what people say and what people do. And that gap tells them everything they need to know. They start to notice patterns they've been trained to ignore. How certain people only call when they need something. How some friends only show up when life is going well, but disappear when things get hard. How family members take and take and take, but call you selfish the moment you stop giving. Most people call this paranoia. Family members say they're being negative, looking for problems, creating drama where none exists. Friends accuse them of being too sensitive, too suspicious, too judgmental, but they're not imagining things. They're finally trusting what they've always seen, but were taught to ignore. Their nervous system has been trained by years of trauma to detect inconsistency and danger. And now, without the desperate need for approval clouding their judgment, that system is operating at peak efficiency. They're not paranoid, they're aware, and awareness in a world full of unconscious people looks like paranoia to those who refuse to see clearly. Jung noted in his clinical work that during phases of awakening consciousness, individuals often become very quiet in social settings. People interpret this as depression or withdrawal. It's actually the opposite. They're conducting psychological research in real time. Every conversation becomes a data collection opportunity. Every interaction reveals information that others miss completely. They're watching who keeps their word and who makes excuses, who shows up consistently and who only appears when it's convenient, who asks about their life and who only talks about themselves, who respects boundaries and who punishes them for having any. The data is conclusive, and it's often devastating. Stage 2, shadow integration. This is where things get truly dangerous, and it's where most people in their lives start to panic, because the isolated individual stops being nice and starts being real. They begin what Jung extensively documented as shadow work, accepting their own capacity for darkness, aggression, and self-protection. Jung understood something that most modern psychology still struggles with. You cannot heal what you cannot acknowledge. And these individuals had spent their entire lives denying their shadow, denying their anger, denying their resentment, denying their right to boundaries, to standards, to expectations of reciprocity. They believed that having boundaries made them bad, that saying no made them selfish, that protecting themselves made them cruel, that expecting basic respect made them demanding, that wanting reciprocity made them transactional. So they gave and gave and gave until there was nothing left, until they were hollow shells performing kindness while dying inside. Shadow integration, as Jung described it, means accepting the full spectrum of human emotion and capacity. Yes, they can be gentle, but they can also be ruthless. Yes, they can be compassionate, but they can also be cold. Yes, they can forgive, but they can also cut someone off with surgical precision and never look back. They realize they've been denying themselves access to half of their emotional range. They've been taught that anger is bad, that boundaries are mean, that protecting yourself is selfish. But anger is information. Boundaries are healthy. Self-protection is necessary. And they're finally giving themselves permission to access the parts of themselves they were taught to suppress. This terrifies everyone around them. The person who used to absorb everyone's bad behavior starts reflecting it back like a mirror. The person who used to accept disrespect starts naming it clearly and removing themselves from its presence. The person who used to apologize for existing starts taking up space without explanation or justification. The person who used to smile through pain starts showing their real feelings. The person who used to say yes to everything starts saying no without guilt. The person who used to chase after people starts letting them go without a fight. People don't like this. People liked them better when they were manageable, when they could be guilted, manipulated, controlled, when their kindness could be taken for granted, when their presence could be assumed, when their forgiveness was guaranteed. Now they can't be. And that loss of control makes people react with shocking cruelty. Stage 3. The chrysalis. Total isolation. This is the danger zone, the stage where the majority of people fail, where they either retreat back into their old patterns because the loneliness becomes unbearable, or descend into bitterness and permanent isolation. But the individual who successfully navigates this stage, they emerge as something extraordinary. They cut everyone off to rebuild their mind, not out of hatred, not out of revenge, out of necessity. They disappear from social circles, stop answering messages that used to trigger immediate anxiety, delete their presence from places where they used to perform for scraps of validation. They withdraw so completely that people think they've had a mental breakdown. They haven't broken down. They're breaking through. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his practice. Let me share a composite example based on patterns he documented across multiple cases involving what he called the withdrawal of projections. Consider the profile of someone who had been the family mediator for decades, the friend everyone called in, crisis. The co-worker who stayed late to help others meet their deadlines while their own life fell apart. Then one day, nothing. Radio silence. Months of complete withdrawal that left everyone confused and angry. The phone calls they don't answer pile up. The guilt-tripping messages they don't respond to multiply. The accusations of being cold, of changing, of abandoning people start flowing in. And they read every single one without replying, because they're finally seeing clearly who actually cared about them versus who just cared about what they provided. What was happening during that silence? Reconstruction. They were finally giving themselves what they'd spent decades giving others. Attention, patience, understanding, space to feel without judgment, space to heal without performance, space to discover who they actually were beneath all the roles they'd been playing. During this isolation, something remarkable happens. They start to see their entire life with new eyes. All the times they were manipulated and called it love. All the moments they ignored screaming intuition to keep the peace. All the relationships where they gave everything and received nothing but criticism for not giving more. They see how many times they apologized for other people's bad behavior. How many times they made excuses for people who wouldn't make a single excuse for them. How many times they showed up for people who never showed up for them. How many times they prioritized people who made them an option. The clarity is brutal, absolutely devastating. They realize how many years they wasted on people who never deserved them. How much pain they endured that they never had to endure. How many times they betrayed themselves to avoid being abandoned by people who were never truly present anyway. But here's what Jung found so crucial. This brutal clarity doesn't destroy them. It liberates them, because you can't heal what you won't acknowledge, and they're finally acknowledging everything. Every wound, every betrayal, every moment they chose others over themselves. Every time they silenced their own needs to accommodate someone else's wants. Society interprets this withdrawal as weakness. Family members call it selfishness, abandonment, punishment. Friends call it overreaction, sensitivity, holding grudges. People who benefited from their lack of boundaries suddenly become experts on mental health, suggesting therapy, medication, intervention. But the withdrawing individual isn't running away from the world. They're running toward themselves. They're choosing their healing over everyone else's comfort for the first time in their lives. And that choice, that single decision to prioritize themselves, triggers everyone who relied on them staying small. Stage 4, the strategic return. They come back, but they're different. Fundamentally, irreversibly, permanently different. They've developed what might be called selective empathy. They haven't lost their ability to feel deeply, care intensely, love completely. They've gained the wisdom to choose where that energy goes. And once they withdraw it, it never comes back. This is what makes them dangerous. Not to good people, not to genuine connections, not to people who actually reciprocate care and respect, but to manipulators, users, and energy vampires. Because they cannot be manipulated anymore. You can't guilt trip someone who has already survived the worst guilt imaginable. Someone who has sat alone with every accusation, every criticism, every claim that they're not enough, and decided those voices were wrong. You can't gaslight someone who trusts their own perception completely and has receipts to back it up. You can't control someone who would rather be alone forever than compromise their peace for 5 minutes. They return to the world with new standards, non-negotiable boundaries, clear expectations, and zero tolerance for the behaviors they use to absorb without complaint. They're not mean about it. They're not dramatic about it. They're just clear. And that clarity terrifies people who are used to operating in ambiguity. Now let me show you why people fear them so much. It's not because these transformed individuals are cruel or vindictive. It's because of what Jung extensively documented as shadow projection. Toxic people unconsciously try to destroy these awakened individuals, not because they did anything wrong, but because they act as a mirror to the toxic person's unacknowledged bad behavior. Jung wrote about this extensively. When someone's shadow is reflected back through another person's clear perception, the unconscious mind has two choices: integrate the shadow or attack the mirror. And most people choose to attack the mirror, because integration requires work, honesty, and uncomfortable self-reflection. Attacking the mirror just requires finding other people who will agree that the mirror is the problem. We see this illustrated clearly in a narrative that captures the pattern Jung observed repeatedly. Consider the profile of someone who was quiet for years, who absorbed everyone's dysfunction without complaint, who smiled through personal suffering to make others comfortable, who twisted herself into shapes that didn't fit, just to maintain relationships that were never reciprocal. Then one day, she stopped. She stopped pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. She stopped absorbing other people's emotions like a sponge. She stopped performing emotional labor for people who wouldn't cross the street for her. And she ruthlessly cut everyone off with surgical precision, not with drama, not with long explanations, not with angry confrontations or public call-outs, just with clarity and decisive action. She simply stopped participating in dynamics that required her to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating than her authentic self. She stopped showing up for people who only wanted her around when she was useful. People called her cold, changed, bitter, mean, unforgiving, cruel. They said she'd lost herself, that she wasn't the person they knew anymore. And they were right. She wasn't that person anymore. That person was a performance, a mask, a role she played to earn love she should have received freely. But she hadn't become cold. She'd become conscious. She hadn't lost her warmth. She'd stopped giving it to people who used it as a weapon against her. She hadn't become bitter. She'd become boundaried. And people who benefited from her having no boundaries couldn't tell the difference. This is the real danger. The awakened individual can see through manipulation with perfect clarity. They know every trick because those tricks were used on them for years. They know every guilt trip, every gaslighting tactic, every emotional manipulation strategy. They know the love bombing followed by devaluation. They know the apology without changed behavior. They know the promise that's never kept. They know the crisis that's always your responsibility to fix.
You know, Anna Paulina.
Yeah.
There's a house in Saskatchewan.
this. They. They. Thank you. Thank you for stopping. Hi. Hello. Sri Lanka. Nice, 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 nice. Ooh. Ooh. A little bit about Sri Lanka, a little bit. Isn't it in, fuck, I forget where it is, but I've heard of it. I've definitely heard of it before.